Hi, I'm John Green. Welcome to my salon. This is Mental Floss Video, and you know we got the word museum from the Greeks? They used to build temples to the muses, who were the goddesses of art and science. So the temples featured sculptures, and intellectuals would hang out there. These buildings were known as museums. We've had museums pretty much ever since. Anyway, that's the first of many facts about museums I'm going to share with you today in this video, brought to you by Geico. In 1683, the first public museum on record opened in Oxford, England. It was called the Ashmolean Museum, and going through it fast meant saving money because admission fees were calculated based on how much time people spent there. But there were wax museums even earlier, like people have been making wax statues since the Middle Ages, and in the late 17th century, French sculptor Antoine Benoit had a group of 43 wax figures in an exhibit that traveled the country. Speaking of which, Madame Tussauds wax museums are named after a real person, Marie Tussaud. She was an artist and made her first wax figure in 1778 at the age of 17. It was of Voltaire. Nowadays, including a couple of Madame Tussauds, there are a whopping 35,000 museums in the United States, but only about 3% of them, 1,049 in fact, are accredited by the American Alliance of Museums. Here's another low percentage. On average, U.S. museums get an estimated 5% of their revenue from admission costs. Speaking of admission, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London had an interesting policy in the 19th century. There was free admission to the main building 3 days a week, and then they charged money on the other 3 days. That kept the museum quieter, sometimes helping people like students who were doing research. On the 7th day, they were closed, like everything in Victorian England. I like that policy, but I think I like the Ashmoleans policy more. I want to be able to rush through a museum and save some money. Another famous London museum is the British Museum. This one began with one man's collection of 71,000 artifacts. He was a naturalist and physician named Sir Hans Sloane. In Sloane's will, he left the items to King George II, who, didn't have enough stuff or money, I guess, which was how the museum got its start in 1753. Staying with the British Museum, but jumping forward in time a bit, in 2014, filmmakers did a screening of Night at the Museum 3: Secret of the Tomb there, because that's where the film takes place. Employees were appalled by the lack of scientific accuracy at the screening, though. At one point in the movie, a recreation of Pompeii gets covered in lava, and according to one source, an audience member audibly said, "There was no lava at Pompeii. Vesuvius erupted with a pyroclastic flow." I guess they hadn't seen Night at the Museums 1 or 2, which are not noted for their scientific accuracy. So here's an interesting story about a piece of art from 1959 by Robert Rauschenberg, currently at the MoMA in New York City. So it was inherited by the estate of an art dealer, and it is a collage containing part of a taxidermied bald eagle, a bird that is protected by the federal government, meaning it was illegal to sell dead versions of it. But the IRS wanted to collect $29.2 million in taxes from the estate because of the piece's value, so eventually the estate agreed to donate it to a museum so they wouldn't have to pay those taxes. Slightly off topic, but in general, the art of tax avoidance involves quite a lot of art. Anyway, another amazing New York City museum is the Guggenheim. In 1939, the museum started as the Museum of Non-Objective Painting in a former automobile showroom on East 54th Street. Robert De Niro's dad was actually one of the guards there, part-time while working on his own painting career. There are some interesting corporate museums in San Francisco. Companies that have their own museums there include Intel, Levi, Wells Fargo, and Takara Saki. Another place worth visiting, the Atomic Bomb Museum in New Mexico. Although it's often called a museum, it's actually just a large expanse of desert with a black pyramid commemorating this as the site where the first atomic bomb was detonated. But you should probably schedule well in advance because it's only open to the public for 6 hours in the spring and 6 hours in the fall. Then there's the Intuit Museum in Chicago, which is interesting because it displays the work of so-called outsider artists who don't have much interaction with the typical world of art history or art practice. Of course, lots of museums have artifacts from ancient Egypt, but the best such museum is the Egyptian Museum in, Egypt, specifically in Cairo. The Egyptian Museum was in the news recently because in August 2014, 2 employees damaged King Tut's burial mask, and rather than coming clean, they tried to fix it themselves by using epoxy glue. The mask has since been restored, but the employees face charges. While we're on the subject of damaged museum artifacts, in 1985, a man threw sulfuric acid on a Rembrandt painting at the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, Russia. The painting was called Danae, and it was also sliced with a knife. Staff took 12 years to restore it, but now it's back on display. By the way, the Hermitage Museum is the largest art gallery in Russia. In 1764, Catherine the Great bought 255 paintings from Berlin, and that was the original collection, but it's grown a fair bit since then. And we can actually thank the Hermitage Museum for the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., because between 1930 and 1931, Andrew Mellon bought 21 of their paintings to help the Soviet economy. A few years later, Mellon gave those paintings to the United States government, and that's how the National Gallery began. So thanks, Soviet communism! Florence, Italy is home to an amazing collection of art, so when there was a huge flood there in 1966, people were, of course, very worried about that art, and with good reason. But then almost 1,000 people from all over the world, known as mud angels, took on the risky job of going to locations like the Uffizi Museum and salvaging what they could. But let's go back to New York City for a minute. The outside of the Metropolitan Museum is actually unfinished. There are 4 stacks of stone toward the top of the building that were supposed to be carved into statues at the beginning of the 20th century, but the trustees vetoed the expensive project and the piles of stones still remain. One of the many cool things inside the Met is the oldest surviving piano. It's an Italian instrument from 1720. The Reina Sofia, another world-class museum, is in a building that's actually a repurposed hospital that dated originally from the 18th century. The museum itself opened in 1990. And the Tate Modern Museum in London also has an interesting past. It's an old power station. The building was finished in 1963 and functional until the 1980s. The museum opened in May of 2000. Before closing a few years ago, the Retretti Art Museum in Finland had an unusual way of displaying art. The building has a series of underground caves, and the galleries were as far as 100 feet underground. Speaking of caves, in 2005, the artist Banksy tricked the staff at the British Museum by taping up a cave painting in their gallery of Roman artifacts. Of course, it wasn't actually a cave painting. The figure in it was pushing a shopping cart, for one thing. Moving from fake cave art to real Chinese art, the largest collection of the latter can be found at the National Palace Museum in Taipei. They have about 650,000 items that are consistently in rotation in groups of 10,000 artifacts. So basically, you gotta go to the museum like 65 times to see it all. Right before World War II broke out, the Palace Museum staff got worried about their priceless collection, so they packed up the entire thing and sent all the artifacts to Shanghai. For that, they needed 4 months and 13,427 crates. The National Gallery London did something similar before World War II. 50 paintings were sent to Wales. Then the Munich Accord was signed in 1938, prompting the staff to have the paintings sent back. 1 year later, it was clear that a war was going to happen, so the staff packed everything up again and sent it to Wales. Because, you know, nobody was gonna bomb Wales. I mean, what are you at war with, sheep? The Tate in London also packed everything up before the war, except for one painting, Stanley Spencer's The Resurrection Cookham, which is about 9 feet by 18 feet. Because of its size, they just built a huge brick wall in front of it. Speaking of the stress paintings put museum staff through, in 1990, the National Gallery of Canada bought a Barnett Newman piece called Voice of Fire for $1.8 million and ignited such a firestorm of controversy that there were debates on the price in Parliament, and the curator of the piece went on national television dressed as the painting to defend the acquisition. An even more interactive piece of art lived at the New Museum in New York between 2011 and 2012. It was a 102-foot-long slide that people could go down. An estimated 30,000 people, including this guy, did so before it closed. About 800 years earlier, the Louvre was built. The location was originally a fortress put up in 1190 to protect citizens from the Vikings. It became a museum in 1793. And it wasn't always called the Louvre. When Napoleon was in power, it got renamed the Musée Napoleon, because of course it did. Anyway, when Napoleon was on the outs in 1814, it became known as the Louvre. While we're on the subject of Napoleon, during the Spanish War of Independence, his cavalry and gunpowder were stored at the El Prado Museum in Spain. These days, there's a lot of sparring among museums about which artifacts should be in which museum, but there's a particularly interesting fight between the British and Greek museums over the Parthenon marbles, sculptures from the 5th century BCE. Basically, the British government bought the statues in 1816 from a lord who said he got them from an Ottoman sultan. In 2009, Greece opened its new Acropolis Museum as a way to show that they had a good location for the marbles, but the British Museum pretty much refuses to give them back, and they're still there to this day, and it's an ongoing argument. Let's move on to some interesting items you can find at the U.S.'s Smithsonian museums. If you're looking to see Warren Harding's silk pajamas, a body that was unintentionally preserved when all of its fat turned into soap, or a taxidermied carrier pigeon who delivered messages during World War I, you should head to Washington, D.C. immediately. One thing you won't find at the Smithsonian: Wonder Woman's invisible plane. For an April Fool's joke in 2015, the museum released a statement saying that it was displaying the plane for one day only. But of course, you know, invisible. We couldn't finish this episode without a fact about museum cuisine. The National Museum of the American Indian, also in Washington, D.C., has a fire pit in its kitchen so it can serve more authentic food. And finally, I returned to my salon to tell you about the fake Amedeo Modigliani painting at the Gallery of Modern Art in Scotland. Experts are pretty sure the work isn't a true Modigliani, but the frame is from the 17th century in Italy, and it's worth quite a lot, so the piece stays in the museum. Thanks for watching Mental Floss video, which is made with the help of all of these lovely people. And thanks again to our friends at Geico for sponsoring today's video. Let me know what your favorite museum is in comments. Also, let me know if you remember the episode of Keeping Up with the Kardashians where Scott and Kourtney thought they had inherited a Modigliani. That one was so good. Anyway, as we say in my hometown, don't forget to be Kourtney. I mean, awesome.